Everybody wants freedom. Everybody wants freedom. Freedom of thought. Freedom to... Good evening, viewers and listeners, and welcome to this special edition of The Rights of the People, a program brought to you by the Thusian Institute for Religious Liberty, Incorporated, a non-governmental, non-profit human rights education services provider. I'm your host, Mrs. Anissa Batiste, and I am one of the Associate Directors of the Thusian Institute for Religious Liberty. Please let us start with a word of prayer. Loving Father in heaven, do grant me the blessings of your Holy Spirit of truth, that as I speak to the people of this country, they may know the truth and nothing but the truth on this very important topic of religion and the Constitution. Thank you for hearing and answering my prayers, and may the people be enlightened about the truth. In Jesus' name, amen. And now, my dear viewers and listeners, remember that our institute may be contacted via email. The address is on your screen. It is TIRL SVG, that's TIRLSVG at firstfreedomthink.com, or you may call telephone numbers 431-2150 or 528-1015. Now, in this evening's broadcast, which is a special broadcast being brought to you here on SVG TV on this Sunday night, we will be looking at the topic Answering Parnel Campbell's Shadows. Yes, Answering Parnel Campbell's Shadows. This program became necessary to answer arguments that were presented in Mr. Parnel Campbell's Monday, 30th April 2012 edition of The Law and You, where he discussed the topic of religion and the Constitution. And it is absolutely necessary for us as a human rights education services provider with a special emphasis on the religious liberty right to address the comments that he made in his program. We will be doing so by playing the clips of Mr. Campbell's voice explaining certain things and answering them accordingly. Let us go right into it. I want you to listen to this first clip where Mr. Parnel Campbell quotes Section 9, subsection 1 and subsection 5 and paragraph B of the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and gives some explanations on what he claims it is saying. Listen to this clip.
Except with his own consent, a person shall not be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of conscience, including freedom of thought and of religion, freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and both in public and in private, to manifest and propagate his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. What the Constitution is protecting is the absolute right of a person to observe and practice his own religion, his own religious beliefs, his own form of worship. It deals with the active practicing of one's own religion. In other words, under our Constitution, a person is perfectly free to practice his religion as he sees fit, or hers for that matter. Subsection 5, however, goes on to say that nothing that you find in a law which provides for these matters should be regarded as violating the freedom of religion. In other words, a country can have laws which make provision for these things without having those laws deemed to have contradicted or violated the constitutional right to freedom of religion. And these are the sorts of laws which can be passed. Laws which make provision which is reasonably required, A, in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. B, for the purpose, that is, laws can be made for the purpose of protecting the rights and freedoms of other persons, including their right to observe and practice any religion, without the unsolicited intervention of members of any other religion. What the Constitution is saying, that persons of one religion do not have the right to interfere with persons of another religion. The Constitution calls it the unsolicited intervention of members of any other religion. In other words, subsection 1 gives you the right to practice your own religion. But subsection 5, paragraph B is saying that your right to practice your religion does not extend to your right to interfere with somebody else's religion. The Constitution calls it the unsolicited intervention in another person's religion. So what the Constitution in a nutshell is saying, mind your own religious business and don't interfere with other people's religious business. And unless you grasp the importance of this distinction, you would fail to understand why you are not free at large to castigate other people's religious beliefs. Because when you castigate or denounce other people's beliefs, you are interfering with their freedom of religion. Because the Constitution says the same freedom you have to worship as you please, they should have the same freedom to worship as they please. So that one has to be very careful how one makes comments which are adverse to another person's religion. I'm not saying that every critical comment would be deemed to be adverse to another person's religion, but you have to be careful. Mind your own religious business. Once you start to make negative comments about somebody else's religion, you are tending to violate that person's right to worship the way they please. So I do not see how on earth it could be wrong for a political party to have a policy which says that its candidates and potential candidates should not make statements which are adverse to religious beliefs or to religions. That is perfectly in keeping with the Constitution.
Yes, my dear viewers, listeners, you would have heard him explain that the Constitution is saying certain things about the religious liberty right. I want to first of all establish that none of the clauses that Campbell cites in his presentation fits or matches the explanation he gives. He misleads the public on the real meaning of the Constitution in those sections, and I will tell you how. He speaks about the exception in paragraph B of subsection 5, which basically says that while you have the right to freedom of your religion and freedom to practice it in public and in private and to propagate it, that freedom is subjected to the right of protection of other persons to practice and observe their religion without the unsolicited intervention of members of any other religion. And then Mr. Campbell goes on to explain what he deems to be the meaning of that expression, without the unsolicited intervention of members of any other religion. Unsolicited intervention of members of any other religion is unsolicited intervention insofar as the observance and practice of any religion is concerned. In other words, my dear viewers, when we talk about you having the right to practice and observe your religion without the unsolicited intervention of another person, we are saying that the person's intervention must be the kind which interferes with the observance and practice of your religion. That would be considered unsolicited intervention. It must be a kind of intervention that interferes with your practice and observance of your religion. And when the Constitution says it is unsolicited, it means simply that you did not invite that kind of intervention. But the point here is, in all of Mr. Campbell's explanations, he gives the impression that criticism of religious doctrine represents unsolicited intervention in the practice and observance of another person's religion. And nothing could be further from the truth. And here is why, my dear people. Let's examine some things here. The very fact that in St. Vincent and the Grenadines we have the existence of several religious groups is evidence that each religious establishment have teachings that are critical of each other. The very fact that they exist distinct and separate from each other. And we could look at some examples, and the question you have to ask yourself is, does the difference of religious teachings, which are often criticisms of each other's teachings, does that represent hindering any one group from practicing and observing their religion? Of course not. So consider this. For years, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has criticized the Roman Catholic Church for their teaching that the Pope is God on earth. For years, evangelicals have criticized the Roman Catholics for the worship of Mary, for example. For years, the Rastafarians have criticized the Roman Catholics by showing that the Pope is the Antichrist. And for years, the Roman Catholic themselves have criticized other religions for not having the Pope as the head of the church and for not partaking of the Eucharist. The idea that the bread and the wine partaken of at communion is the literal flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. For years, these criticisms have taken place. These doctrinal differences exist. The question is, have those doctrinal differences interfered with the ability to practice and observe religion? Of course not. Despite the criticism of each other's doctrines, each church and establishment has had the opportunity to continue practicing their religion, to continue to observe their religion. So when Mr. Campbell's statements gives this idea that when the Constitution says, while you practice your religion, you don't have the right to have what you call unsolicited intervention into the practice and observance of another person's religion, and he claims that criticism of a person's religion constitutes unsolicited intervention. That is not so. So you have him saying things like, and I quote, so the Constitution is saying, look, keep your hands off other people's religion. Don't interfere with another person's form of worship. How does criticism interfere with your form of worship? You may like the criticism, you may dislike it, you may disagree with it. It doesn't stop you from continuing to practice and observe your religion. So criticism of the religious teaching is not unsolicited intervention with the practice or observance of the person's religion. Mr. Campbell also says things like, mind your own religious business and do not interfere with other people's religious business. Another quotation, you are not free at large to castigate or denounce other people's religious beliefs. Another quotation, so nobody should feel that the Constitution gives a person a blanket right to denounce another person's religion. End of quote. The issue, my dear viewers, is that the Constitution is not outlawing criticism of religious teachings when it says that a person must have the right to practice and observe his religion without the unsolicited intervention of other persons of another religion. It is not outlawing criticism of religious doctrines at all. It is merely saying that the individual must not have a kind of interference that stops him from practicing or observing his religion. And I will give you some examples of that just now. But what we are seeing so far is that the words of Mr. Campbell are misleading. But I want to point out a few things. Firstly, it is clear to me, even as we go along and you hear the other clips, that Mr. Campbell really did his program to get on my case. Why do I say this? In as much as he is saying the Constitution doesn't give a person the blanket right to denounce other people's religion, yet he does not in his program address the fact that the Prime Minister had said in answer to a journalist's question on the so-called satanic cult, the Prime Minister had said that such groups should be, and I quote, opposed, denounced, and criticized, end of quote. Now, by Mr. Campbell's standards, the Prime Minister has broken the Constitution because he claims that the Constitution basically is saying you can't denounce another person's religion, but the Prime Minister said in answer to a journalist's question that the so-called cult should be denounced. So why didn't Mr. Campbell say on TV that the Prime Minister was wrong and he was breaching the Constitution for calling for the denunciation of a satanic cult? Why didn't he say that? You see, my dear people, according to Campbell's explanation, he should really be telling the Prime Minister that he was breaking the law. But the reality is, nothing could be further than the truth. Because when you simply examine the meaning of the word denounce, it simply means to criticize or to condemn. An example given in a dictionary, in a sentence, the Pope denounced abortion, end of quote. So it's simply showing you criticize a particular behavior or a particular teaching or idea. That is what denounce means. So when the Prime Minister denounced the so-called satanic cult, he was simply criticizing it. And that is completely lawful under the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to criticize a religious teaching or idea. The point about it is that Mr. Campbell didn't point that out, but he's saying the Constitution is saying you shouldn't denounce religion. Instead, he says that not denouncing other people's religion is perfectly in keeping with the Constitution. But what he didn't do, he didn't take Cheflon Ballantyne's statement because he was talking about the whole issue surrounding the NDP and my firing and the statement that Mr. Ballantyne has made. He didn't take it and show that Mr. Ballantyne's statement did not constitute interference with another person's religious observance or practice, which is what the concern of the Constitution is here. He didn't take Ballantyne's statement and show that it did not constitute hindering the observance and practice of another person's religion in as much as it was critical of the teaching of the Catholic Church. He didn't do that. He just left the issue opened so that people could be misled. But what he should have really shown is that criticism is not outlawed by the Constitution, section 9(5)b, when it says that it guarantees the freedom of a person to practice and observe their religion without unsolicited intervention of another person of another religion. Now, if after 41 years of studying the law, a person cannot present the facts as clear and plain and straight, then something has to be terribly wrong, and I would never trust such a person like that as a lawyer. I reiterate to you, my dear viewers, that criticism of a religious teaching does not constitute or mean hindrance of or interference with a person's right to observe and practice his or her religion. And Mr. Campbell ought to know this. The truth is, Mr. Ballantyne's statement, which was a critical comment, did not constitute interference or unsolicited intervention into the practice or observance of another religion. He was well within the Constitution to make his statements that were critical. And in fact, the New Democratic Party's policy that said that you couldn't criticize religion, it is that policy which represented an assault on the constitutional freedom of conscience of Mr. Ballantyne and of myself. The policy telling you don't criticize religion is telling you not to do something that it is within your freedom under the Constitution to do. So what really constitutes unsolicited intervention? Let me give you a few examples. It is like this. Let's say you're in church and you're singing, "Oh, how I love Jesus." And 4 people of another religious group comes into the church service and start singing another song. They practically take over the service, interrupt what you are doing, and by their intervention, which you did not invite them to do, that is what unsolicited means, by their intervention, they disrupt you and they literally stop you or hinder you from your practice and observance as it is going on there. That is like an example of unsolicited intervention. Another example, you're having a crusade somewhere on the street and you have authority to be where you are on the street corner. You've done the relevant notification of the police and so on and so forth, gotten the relevant permission. And as you're carrying out your crusade, some other group of some other religion comes without invitation. They come on the same site where you have authority to be. They begin to shout using bullhorns, messages that are against you, that disrupts your event and literally interferes with your practice and observance of your religion. Those are examples of unsolicited intervention that interferes with your practice and your observance. But to criticize a religious teaching on a radio program, on a TV program, in a debate, in a discussion, that does not stop a person from practicing and observing his or her religion. And these kind of errors should not be spread by someone who boasts having studied the law for 41 years. But let's move on quickly to the second part. Let's listen to this second 5-minute clip of Mr. Campbell. Listen.
Now, there is one particular law in the criminal code which makes it abundantly clear that we have to respect the religious rights of other persons and not just our own. I turn to the criminal code, which is found in chapter 171 of the Revised Laws of St. Vincent and Grenadines 2009. The criminal code has a chapter 7 called Offenses Relating to Religion. And this is what the criminal code says about offenses relating to religion. The one I want to read is section 119 of the criminal code, chapter 171. This is what our law provides. Any person who, with the intention of wounding the religious feeling of any other person, writes any word, or utters any word, or makes any gesture or sound in the sight or hearing of any other person, or places any object in the sight of any other person, is guilty of an offense and liable to imprisonment for 2 years. In other words, if you have the intention of wounding the religious feeling of any other person, in other words, insulting anyone's religion, and thereby wounding the feelings, in religious feelings of any person, by writing any word or speaking any word, you can be found guilty of an offense and liable to imprisonment for 2 years. This is the sort of law that the Constitution is saying is quite in order. This is a law which protects the religious feelings of all persons. Nobody has a right to insult your religion or to wound your religious feeling. The law says that is unlawful, and the Constitution says such a law which penalizes that unlawful conduct is perfectly okay. So that section 119 of the Criminal Code is perfectly constitutional. And the Constitution says that you do not have the right to insult someone's religion. So that this myth that is being spread, that in our Constitution you have a perfect liberty to say what you want, is not correct. Now, the question as to what constitutes an insult to a person's religion may be a debatable question depending on what is said and the context in which it is said. Not every discussion on theological matters would amount to insulting somebody else's religion. It is a question of degree and the context in which it is said, but I just want you to know that no one is free to go and insult, pull down another person's religion and say they are exercising their God-given constitutional rights. That is not so. Constitution says, you have your religion, let other people have their religion. Don't interfere with other people's religion. Don't tell them what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong. That is not your business. You study your own religious business. That is what my understanding of the Constitution is. And it is a Constitution I've been studying for the past 41 years.
Yes, my dear viewers, you would have heard Mr. Campbell quote from the Criminal Code, Chapter 171 of the Revised Edition of the Laws of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2009, Chapter 7, Offenses Relating to Religion. And in particular, I want to zoom in on Section 119, which he cited. Again, I want to say to you that Mr. Campbell's comments on this law is also misleading. He gives the impression that criticizing religion is breaking this law, but this is an untruth, and it is important for me to explain this, because that law is a serious law. To break that offense, a person could go to jail for 2 years, and here you have Mr. Campbell citing this offense and claiming, essentially, that criticizing a religious teaching amounts to breaching this offense, and nothing could be further than the truth. But let me explain why I say he misrepresents the law. In this particular law, it speaks about how the offense is that you mustn't publish, write, or say statements or make gestures that can wound the religious feelings of another person. And Mr. Campbell gives explanations and basically says that you can't do that, but he doesn't give explanations of what the offense is really speaking about. Well, I have done some research and I want to present something to you. When you look back in history, in England and Wales, the jurisdiction upon which our law is based on, when you look back there, there is something called the Law Commission Report number 145, Criminal Law, Offenses Against Religion and Public Worship. And this particular report was laid before the Parliament in England by the Lord High Chancellor pursuant to Section 3, subsection 2 of the Law Commissions Act 1965, and it was ordered by the House of Commons to be printed on the 18th of June 1985 in London. I point that out. So this is a report that was done for the Parliament in England and was published in 1985. What did this document do? This document, it primarily recommended to the Parliament that the blasphemy and blasphemy libel laws should be abolished, and other offences related to public worship in England and Wales. But more importantly, of the 5 commissioners who sat on this law commission examining these laws, there were 2 commissioners by the name of Ralph Gibson and Brian Davenport, and both of them recommended the creation of a new offence in something called a minority report. What they said in their recommendation of a new offence is what is largely behind the offense that Mr. Campbell cited in Section 119 of our Criminal Code under Chapter 7, Offenses Against Religion. Essentially, this new offense that was recommended by these 2 commissioners of the Law Commission Report number 145 stated that citizens should not, and I quote, insult or outrage the religious feelings of others. End of quote. So this new offense is pretty much like the one that Mr. Campbell cited in section 119 of our criminal code, which speaks to an offense against the wounding of the religious feelings of others. It's pretty much the same thing. But what did these commissioners recommend when they said this new offense should be created? Did they say that to wound and insult the religious feelings of another meant you couldn't criticize religion? Did they say it meant you couldn't dispute religious teachings? No. And I want to quote for you what they said. I want to give you in point form what this new offense was meant to do from what it was not meant to do or deal with. And I want to show you from the actual Law Commission report what was said. What did this new offense not do? It did not seek to outlaw criticism of religion. Point number 2. It did not seek to outlaw criticism or ridicule in sharp terms of religion. And I'm using the very words in the Law Commission report, which I'll cite for you just now. 3. It did not outlaw statements which point out folly or evil in what religious people consider sacred. Point number 4. It did not outlaw expert theological evidence as basis of critical statements. And point number 5, it did not outlaw religious disputations within or between sects or religious groups. What did it do? What was the real intention of this new offense that would be against the wounding and insulting of religious feelings? What was the intention? What would it do? 1. It outlaws the publication of, and I quote, grossly abusive or insulting material published with the purpose of wounding or outraging religious feelings. 2. It outlaws clear cases of publication whose, and I quote, purpose is to outrage religious feelings, proven by the terms of the publication itself. End of quote. Point number 3. It outlaws, and I quote, the deliberate causing of outrage. End of quote. Point number 4. It is meant to, quote, penalize only the publication of material which is proved to have been published with the purpose of causing outrage. Now, I have pointed out the things to you that the new offense against wounding and insulting people's religious feelings, the things that it meant to deal with and the things that it didn't mean to deal with. And I'm going to quote for you now from the actual Law Commission report to prove this. I'm quoting from page 43 and page 44. So when Campbell cites the section 119 of the criminal code and says, oh, you know, and we have a law that says you're not supposed to wound people's religious feelings, and he gives the impression that to criticize a religious doctrine is to wound people's religious feelings. That is not what that offense was meant to deal with. And I'm quoting to you the original statements of the commission report, the Law Commission report, which recommended such an offense and what it was intended to deal with. So I'm quoting paragraph 5.6 of the Law Commission report. And this is what the commissioners were saying, and I quote, the new offense should require proof of a mental element, namely that the grossly abusive or insulting material be published with the purpose to wound or outrage religious feelings. End of quote. So they made it absolutely clear that you had to be able to prove that the individual who was publishing the information had mental intent, had intention to grossly abuse and insult the religious feelings, to wound or outrage the religious feelings of the person whose religion they were publishing the information about. Now, these words are very important because it shows the degree that the offense was seeking to deal with, the degree of the publication. And here it is saying you had to be able to prove mental intention to wound and outrage. Listen to these other quotations showing you it wasn't saying people shouldn't criticize religion. It wasn't saying people shouldn't have disputations on religious teachings. Listen to them. I give you another quotation. In clear cases, the purpose to outrage religious feelings would be capable of proof by the terms of the publication itself. So you didn't have to go guessing the intent. They said that the very words, the very terms used in the publication would prove that it was deliberately meant to outrage the religious feelings of the individual. Listen to this though. The mere fact, however, that feelings were outraged would not be sufficient. It is the deliberate causing of outrage at which the new offense should strike. End of quote. So take the example. The Rastafarians say the Catholics, the Pope is Antichrist. Now a Catholic may not like that, and they may feel outraged by the statement. The law commissioners are saying it is not enough to prove that there were feelings of outrage. You had to prove that there was deliberate intent to outrage the feelings of the person. Why is this distinction necessary? Because you see, it will go on to tell you that if the person is able to bring proof to substantiate what they are saying, you can't say that is what the offense is striking at. They must be able to prove mischief in trying to outrage a person's feelings. And I'm going to give you a perfect example of where that happened in the history of England. But let's go on to another quotation from the Law Commission report. Paragraph 5.7. It says, any new offense should not, listen to this carefully, I start again, any new offense should not seek to protect adherents of a religion or the religion itself from argument or from the demonstration of the alleged or actual falsity or mischief of the teaching of that religion. This must be so even if such argument employs criticism or ridicule in sharp terms. Let me pause there. The law commissioners clearly said, look, when we talk about this new offense against outraging and wounding the religious feelings of people, we are not trying to protect religions and adherents of religions from argument or from the demonstration of the alleged or actual falsity or mischief of the teaching of that religion. If somebody wanted to argue on the religious teaching and point out what they consider to be falsehood in the religious teaching, we are not saying they can't do that, you know. That's what they're saying here. They say even if the person's argument employed criticism or ridicule in sharp terms, it said it isn't meant to strike at that. The offense is not meant to strike at that. It isn't meant to stop criticism of the religious teaching. It goes on, and I quote, a statement which asserts folly or evil in that which the religious hold sacred will cause feelings of outrage in many of the religious. But it should not be an offense to publish such a statement merely because the maker of the statement knows that he will cause those feelings. The new offense should penalize only the publication of material which is proved to have been published with the purpose of causing outrage. Did you hear that, my dear people? Here the law commissioners are saying a law like that, an offense like that, which is against the wounding and insulting of religious feelings, it is not stopping people from asserting the folly or evil in the religious teaching. It is not stopping people from publishing their statements merely because they know a person will feel bad about it. Obviously, if a person doesn't agree with what you're saying, they will feel bad. But that doesn't mean you are guilty of a crime for saying it. But they make a distinction and they say the publication, what should be penalized is if the publication of the material is proven to have been published with the purpose of causing outrage. And again, I'm coming to a perfect example of that. But let me give you one more quotation from the law commissioners to explain further what they did not intend to touch by such an offense. It says here in paragraph 5.8 of the Law Commission report of number 145, quote, under the existing law, expert theological evidence is normally inadmissible, either for the prosecution or the defense. It seems to us that for the purposes of any new offense extending to all religions, evidence would on occasion be necessary if only to prove the relevant background of fact and belief, by reference to which the jury could determine whether the material was abusive or insulting and whether there was proof of the purpose to outrage. So the law commissioner said, look, traditionally under blasphemy laws, you couldn't present evidence and say, well, the reason why I say this is because I found this in this book, or this is what they really teach, I've researched it, and here is the quotation. You couldn't provide evidence. But these law commissioners are saying, for this new offense that goes against wounding the religious feeling of a person, we are going to allow evidence, because the evidence might give the background to show that the person is making the statement based on a certain portion of evidence, and this will help the jury to be able to decide whether the material is really abusive or insulting, or whether it was really a case of they just providing proof of what they are saying. And this is important because many times when you criticize religious teaching, you are just pointing out something that sometimes the very religions say, and people get upset and say you shouldn't say that. But if I'm just pointing out what is said historically, or what your religion teaches by virtue of citing your own books, why should that be a crime? And this is what the law commissioners were saying. We are not talking about that. They went on. Religious disputation within or between sects should not, and under the proposed new offense, we think would not become the material for criminal trials. Did you hear that? They said even if you have religious disputes upon issues of doctrines, that is not what the law is dealing with. That is not to become a matter for criminal trial. We're not going to try you criminally because you have a religious argument on doctrines. That is not what the offense is about. Prosecutions would only be brought if there were clear evidence of grossly abusive material from which a purpose to cause outrage to religious feelings could be inferred. End of quote. I took the time to show you the original intention of the commissioners of the Law Commission Report number 145 when they did that report proposing and recommending that new offense, which we see similarly in section 119 of our code, because I want to tell you that Mr. Campbell's representation of what the code is saying is wrong. He's given the impression that mere and simple criticism of doctrine is a criminal offense when it is not so, because the people who proposed the offense were saying we don't intend to outlaw criticism, we don't intend to outlaw disputings of religious ideas. We are simply saying if the publication reaches a stage where it is clearly intended to outrage the religious feelings of the person, that is the kind of thing we intend to outlaw by the creation of this new offense. Let me give you a perfect example as we go along. There is a case called Whitehouse and Lemon 1977. And the basic facts of this case are a man called James Kirkup wrote a poem called The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name, and it was published in the 3rd June 1976 issue of a periodical called Gay News. This poem was written from the viewpoint of a Roman centurion, graphically describing him having sex with Jesus after his crucifixion. And it also claims that Jesus had had sex with numerous disciples, guards, and even Pontius Pilate. Listen to me. I have the poem in front of me. It is the most sickening thing I have ever read. And this poem, I just want to give you a brief idea of what it said. I can't read the entire thing. It is too nasty. But I want you to note this. This poem that was published, this newspaper, Gay News, they were charged for breaching the blasphemy laws. One of the lords in the House of Lords, the highest court, Lord Scarman, he described this poem as causing, and I quote, grave offense to the religious feelings of some of their fellow citizens, or as such as to tend to deprave and corrupt persons who are likely to read them. End of quote. So here you have Lord Scarman in 1977 describing this poem as having the effect of causing grave or serious offense to the religious feelings of the individuals. It is poems and publications like this that the new offense recommended in the 1985 published Law Commission report was meant to outlaw. Let me just read a little piece. The Love That Dares Speak Its Name by James Kirkup. He said, and I quote, "As they took him from the cross, I, the centurion, took him in my arms, the tough, lean body of a man no longer young, beardless, breathless, but well hung. He was still warm. While they prepared the tomb, I kept guard over him. His mother and the Magdalene had gone to fetch clean linen to shroud his nakedness. I was alone with him. For the last time, I kissed his mouth. My tongue found his, bitter with death." Listen to this nastiness. This man is actually saying that the centurion was tonguing off Jesus Christ. This is outrageous to any Christian's religious feelings. He continued, "I licked his wound. The blood was harsh. For the last time, I laid my lips around the tip of that great privy." That's the word I put there. The word he uses is an obscene word. And he literally, I can't say no more. This man is literally saying he put his mouth on Jesus Christ's private part in a poem that was published in 1977. Listen, my dear people, the thing is so sickening. You understand me? And this kind of poem, when it was published, it was ruled as breaching the blasphemy laws in England. And one of the lords in the House of Lords described it as causing grave offense to the religious feelings of people. So this is the kind of publication, that was being spoken of when that offense was recommended, that a person in their religious practice should not publish statements that could wound or insult the religious feelings of others. It was not speaking about simple criticism of religious teachings. It was speaking of outrageous things like this poem. You can go and search it for yourself if you could even stomach to read it. The Love That Dares Speak Its Name. But it's really nasty. And I am saying, Mr. Campbell should have explained these things. He should have shown an example of what it really means to wound and outrage the religious feelings of a person, and not give the impression, by giving no examples, not leave the impression open to mislead the public that simple criticism of religious doctrine is what this offense is against. Because by doing that, he's essentially calling many of us criminals. Because it would mean every time a Rasta criticizes the Catholic doctrine, every time the Catholic criticizes the Adventist doctrine, every time the Adventist criticizes the Catholic doctrine, every time the evangelicals criticize the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine, it would mean that just for criticizing doctrine, they were breaching the criminal code and could be liable to imprisonment for 2 years. This is ridiculous. This is not what the law is saying. But this is the impression Mr. Campbell gives after his 41 years of studying law. He couldn't see and explain these things. I've only been studying law for about 2 going in 3 years, and I could explain it. Why didn't he come clean and show the actual examples that represent a breach of that section 119 of our criminal code, rather than leaving it open and speaking around the issue, giving the impression that to merely criticize religious teaching constitutes breaching that section? It is not true, and such statements are misleading and are not to be trusted, my dear people. That is what I want to say to you here tonight. Mr. Campbell says a lot of other things, which I can't even go into in detail right now. But for example, he says, the Constitution says you have your religion. Let other people have their religion. Don't interfere with other people's religion. Don't tell them what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. That is not your business. You must study your own religious business. This is what my understanding of the Constitution is, and it is a Constitution I have been studying for the past 41 years. Well, Mr. Campbell. You are telling us we must not tell people what they're doing is wrong or what they're doing is right? Are you God? Are you God to the consciences of man? When God tells us to tell people what they're doing wrong, we have to do it. Besides, you who are telling us we must not tell people what they're doing is wrong and what they're doing is right, aren't you telling us what we are doing is wrong? You're doing the very same thing that you're telling people they shouldn't do. But let me give you an example from Scripture, or how God says when He sends you to speak, you have to speak. And if you don't, He will require people's blood at your hands. I quote Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 18 to 20, and it says, "When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way, to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. Again, when a righteous man doth turn from his righteousness, and commit iniquity, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die. Because thou hast not given him warning, he shall die in his sin, and his righteousness which he hath done shall not be remembered, but his blood will I require at thy hand. Here is God in the Bible telling Ezekiel, when you see I send you to warn people about their wrongs, if you don't do it, and that person die in their wrong, I will require their blood. I will require their blood at your hand. In other words, their blood will be upon your shoulder, because you did not follow God's warning and tell them what was wrong. Here is Mr. Campbell telling us, the Constitution tells us, the Constitution is saying we are not supposed to tell people what is wrong about what they're doing or what is right. He's outrageous. He is misrepresenting the Constitution, and he is also out of place, because Mr. Campbell's interpretation is not the dictate to our conscience. God is the one who tells us as Christians, as believers, what we ought to say in our preaching and how we must point out when people are wrong. And yet he's telling us that that is not constitutional, but that is a misrepresentation of the Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't say that you can't tell people what is wrong about their religious practice or belief. It doesn't say that at all. So my dear people, it is not Mr. Campbell that we are to believe and follow and his misrepresentations of the Constitution. It is God. Take Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 for example. You have the apostles who were preaching the gospel. And the council of Jews and Pharisees and scribes told them, well, didn't we tell you not to preach in this name? And they said to them, look, we would rather obey God than man. If God tells us to say something, we have to say it. And this is the whole point of the matter. Let me ask you this. If a man carves out a piece of wood into the image of a bird and bows down to it, is Campbell saying that the Constitution is against you telling that person that it is just a piece of wood in the image of a bird? It is against God's commandment and he or she must not do it? Is he saying the Constitution is telling you mustn't tell them that, even though the word of God says so? And I want you to bear this point in mind, and it is simple. When Mr. Campbell and others say that you shouldn't criticize religion, because to criticize religion is breaching the Constitution, which we have shown is not so, I want you to bear this in mind, that criticism of criticizing is criticizing. Yes. When you criticize, my criticizing, you are criticizing. You can't get away from it. You who say we should not criticize religious teachings, you yourself are engaging in criticizing my religious position that I believe it is okay to criticize religious teachings. So criticism of criticizing is criticizing, Mr. Campbell. Why try to outlaw that which you yourself are engaging in? Is it okay for you to criticize me, but not okay for me to criticize religion? That is a contradiction, and it cannot stand. It cannot stand at all. You see, these are the kind of statements. These are the kind of statements that are keeping our country back, misleading the people, keeping the country dull and dunce and in ignorance, because you're not giving people the truth. You're keeping them in darkness and in shadows. That's why this program is called Answering Campbell's Shadows, because that is what it is. Pure darkness he's spreading, not the truth that would enlighten the people. But I want to read a quotation as we come to the close of the program to help you to understand the importance of criticism of religion. I'm reading to you from a law journal, volume 14, number 2 of 2007, page 96, written by one Ben Clark of Murdoch University. And the name of his article is Freedom of Speech and Criticism of Religion. What are the limits? Freedom of speech and criticism of religion. What are the limits? And in a certain section of his article, he asks the question, does freedom of conscience include the right to criticize religions? And I want to read this portion of what he had to say, and I quote, freedom to criticize religious ideas has long been a foundational principle in Western democratic societies. Did you hear that? This author establishes the fact that for years, the idea that it is okay to criticize religious ideas has been a foundational principle in Western democratic societies. Two important justifications for this position are noted here. Firstly, without this freedom, that is the freedom to criticize religion, without this freedom, those who found religions for financial gain, that is, in order to exploit the religious vulnerability of others, would be legally shielded from public criticism of their religious practices. Let me pause here. This is a very important point Mr. Clark is making. He is saying, look, over the years in history, there have been some who have founded religious organizations for the sole purpose of making money, for the sole purpose of exploiting the vulnerability, the religious vulnerability of people. And if freedom of criticism of religious ideas was not allowed, such persons would get away without the public criticism of their evil deeds. That is very important to note, my dear people. He continues. Secondly, belief which advocates physical violence may also be legally protected. This is true. Where a religion advocates physical violence, if you don't have the freedom to criticize that idea, even though it is a religious idea, then such persons could legally get away with that kind of behavior. And physical violence may be legally protected. This is a very important point to note. The author continues, denunciation of dangerous religious sects has played an important role in human security and development in many states, including Japan and the United States. End of quote. I want to end here. This is this author showing us the benefit of having the freedom to criticize religious ideas. Because not all religious ideas are good for society. Some advocate violence. Some religious organizations may be founded to manipulate and get money out of people. People must have the freedom to criticize and analyze what is going on and say so publicly. So for the Parnel Campbell to advocate that criticism of religion, and for the New Democratic Party to advocate that it is wrong for members to criticize religious teachings, that is what is wrong. They are doing something that in fact is against democracy, and that which has been known to be a principle in Western democratic societies for many years. The New Democratic Party is actually going against democracy by such an unconstitutional policy. And I personally reiterate my call for Mr. Eustace and company to resign, as they are not fit to lead the country when they are advocating that it is wrong to criticize religious ideas, when that is a constitutional freedom protected in our constitution, and when it is proven to be a profitable thing in a democratic state. You cannot make people feel that they are guilty and doing something wrong by just criticizing a religious idea when that is perfectly within the ambits of the Constitution and the law. It is perfectly legitimate speech according to the Constitution and under God. And it is absolutely necessary for the preservation of good in the society and for the exposure of evil where it may lie within even religion. So to have a policy as a political party to tell your members it is wrong, it is not right for you to criticize religion, that is very bad. And it shows that you are not fit for leadership because you don't appreciate and understand the significance and the importance of safeguarding such a freedom in a democratic society. And that is not good enough. I want to say that just as a shadow cabinet cannot really do anything significant for a country because it is not in government, it is just a shadow, so too Campbell's interpretations of the law in the way he has done it can do nothing for the country to enlighten the people of this country. It just places a shadow over the country, which is darkness. And my dear people, I want to say to you that if you want to find out more information about this topic, you may contact us at the Thusian Institute for Religious Liberty. We have a booklet called The Essence of Republicanism and Criticism, where we have examined these issues before and we have shown just what the role of government is and is not when it comes to religious liberty and criticism as a part of free speech. We've studied these things before. Like Jesus Christ overthrew lawyers and doctors with the truth from heaven, we have the truth to show you that could overthrow the misrepresentative arguments of the likes of Parnel Campbell. It could cause people to get in trouble, and unjustly so. But I have shown you certain things tonight that prove clearly that criticism of religious ideas is a part of legitimate exercise of religious liberty. It is constitutional, it is within the ambits of the Constitution, and it is not what Section 119 of the Criminal Code sought to strike at when that offense was created. Please continue to listen to us. We will bring things to you when necessary. Call us if you need to at telephone numbers 431-2150 or 528-1015. Until the next time, I'm Anissa Batiste for the Thusian Institute for Religious Liberty. May God richly bless you. Amen. Everybody wants freedom. Everybody wants freedom. Freedom of thought. Freedom to talk.